I have had this lake on my schedule for a while, and I just realized that this is the first existing lake I will be doing for this channel. For those of you who are looking for lake videos, I am sorry for the delay. I do have a series on a chain of lakes in my mental queue that should be done by the end of the year. But for now, let's get started on one of civilization's greatest lakes, Lake Victoria. Where in the world is Lake Victoria? It lies within the east central part of Africa. On an aerial image of the continent, this is one of the most distinctive lakes because of its size, covering 59,947 square kilometers or 23,146 square miles. It is also the world's largest tropical lake. Oh, and just to add to its greatness, it is also the second largest lake in the world behind Lake Superior. So in terms of the world's lake, yes, it is one of the greatest. Lake Victoria is also one of the world's Great Lakes because of its influence on Western civilization and humanity's development. Starting at the intersection of Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, Lake Victoria drains north into the White Nile, which fed the larger Nile, giving rise to one of the world's foundational civilizations in Egypt. The watershed covers 169,858 square kilometers, or 65,583 square miles. The primary water contributor to the lake is rainfall. The Kagera River, which flows into the lake from the west, is the only significant riverine contributor. The outlet of the lake is through the Nile River, which flows to the north, eventually joining the Blue Nile and draining into the Mediterranean Sea. The Lake Victoria Basin is a fairly young basin, initially being formed around 400,000 years ago. The region in which the lake is formed and is still being shaped is a place where the planet is actively tearing itself apart. The basin is surrounded by tectonic plates that are pulling away from each other and ramming up against the surrounding plates. These rift regions are also creating upwellings that have disturbed historic flow patterns and redirected rivers and overland flow patterns back into the lake, which fills and then again eventually drains north. Thankfully, this is a very slow process. Otherwise, we would be on very shaky ground. Bathymetry refers to the shape of the lake bed. Lake Victoria is considered a generally shallow lake based upon the large surface area and the relatively shallow nature of the bed. The deepest portion of the lake is 800 meters or 260 feet deep. Throughout the lake there are archipelagos or groups of islands that provide topographic diversity and increase the ecological capacity of the overland basin. However, the majority of the lake is not this deep and averages around 40 meters, or 130 feet. With Lake Victoria being a relatively shallow lake and largely being fed by rainwater, it is uniquely susceptible to drought conditions. Within the past 100,000 years, there is evidence that the lake basin dried completely. While the lake has not dried completely in recorded history, the combination of climate change and the growth of population around the lake makes this of particular concern today. Being the largest freshwater tropical lake in the world, Lake Victoria had a remarkable diversity of fish species, including over 350 species of cichlids. These small fish were harvested by people living around the lake using traditional fishing and drying techniques. While there was some pressure on the fishery, the combination of fishing techniques, limited human populations, and the reproductive success of the fish, there is a balance between fish production and human consumption. Around the early 1900s, when the region was under British colonial control, gill nets were introduced. These gill nets turned the lake into a large commercial fishery, which harvested the high productivity. However, this level of commercial harvest was not matched by an increase in reproductive productivity by the cichlids, which resulted in a population decline of these species. Around the same time, land use around the lake began to change with the introduction of commercial agriculture. The intensive use of the land saw more fertilizer running into the lake and increasing additions of nutrients from grazing. This resulted in greater algae production. More algae production often leads to a reduction in lake oxygen levels, which can be harmful to fish. One of the ideas to improve the productivity of a fishery was to introduce a large species that had more flesh and would be more productive for commercial fishermen. So the Nile perch was introduced into Lake Victoria. Unfortunately, this introduction has had multiple long-term outcomes. As cichlids were smaller fish, they could be harvested and air-dried. However, the larger Nile perch needed to be smoked or dried using fire. This resulted in significant deforestation around the lake as more trees were harvested to preserve the newly introduced perch. With the introduction of the Nile perch and the land use changes, the biodiversity in the lake has almost completely flipped. In 1978, cichlids made up around 80% of the biomass in the lake. Today, Nile perch make up 80% of the biomass, with cichlids making up less than 1%. Many of the cichlids are believed to have gone extinct. This change has also created ripple effects for the way the lake works in terms of species diversity. With the increase in nutrients entering the lake from changing land use and the introduction of Nile perch that eat the cichlids, which eat the algae, the lake is seeing more algae production. With more algae production, there is more loss of aquatic oxygen as the algae die and sink to the bottom of the lake. This loss of oxygen is negatively impacting the lake perch, so we are seeing a degradation of the lake through unanticipated consequences. The introduction of the lake perch has resulted in greater deforestation and the loss of the cichlids. The loss of the cichlids is resulting in less algae being eaten. This is seeing greater algae production, which is deoxygenating the lake, which is stressing the perch. So this nasty little cycle of doom has started, potentially leading to a long-term crash in the productivity of the lake. The potential land cover within the Lake Victoria Basin is quite diverse, with vegetation ranging from cropland to trees and upland rainforests. One of the largest vegetation categories within the basin currently is cropland. As mentioned earlier, the conversion of forest and grassland to intensive cropland production with the associated contribution of fertilizers and pesticides has had a detrimental impact on the water quality within the lake. The remaining vegetation communities around the lake are roughly equally divided between grassland, shrubland, and forest. This image shows the pattern of land conversion since 1985. While I know the image of each year is quite small and the legend is difficult to read, one of the most notable features in this map is the increase in pink throughout the basin. The two pink colors represent small-scale and large-scale farms. As you can see, the pink portion of the landscape has grown, spreading throughout the basin until there are very few regions lacking agricultural impacts. Most of this growth is from small-scale farming, where individuals are farming on their own to earn a living. This growth in farmland has come at the expense of forests, shrubland, and grasslands. For those of you who are more interested in graphic displays rather than images, here's a graph that shows the change of landscape with the almost explosive growth of small-scale farmlands, coming at the expense of woodlands, grasslands, and wetlands. In 2014, there were about 35 million people living in the basin. The people living within the basin are primarily living in rural areas, with 80% of the people spread throughout the larger basin. The people in these rural areas are largely practicing subsistence agriculture, split between crop production and grazing. While much of the people living in the rural area are involved in agriculture, women are the primary producers on subsistence crop farms. Much of the land that is farmed within the basin is being managed by landowners with small holdings who are practicing subsistence agriculture with a little bit of extras for sale. Unfortunately, much of the land within the basin is of low agricultural productivity due to limited nutrients, which is resulting in even higher pressure being placed on those few areas that are highly productive, such as wetlands. Grazing is also a major activity within the basin. As with much of the crop production, a large portion of the livestock production goes to personal use and consumption. However, there is some export of meat and leather to urban areas. While there is a rich history of livestock production in the basin going back many centuries, recent changes in the management of livestock has led to more cattle on the land, which is resulting in overgrazing and a loss of grazing land productivity. This combination of marginal farming and grazing practices has resulted in substantial erosion throughout the basin. There is an estimate that over 20,000 tons of soil are lost per hectare per year. When I read that, I was like, 20,000 tons to the lake per year? Well, for such a large basin, that's not so bad. But no, that is 20,000 tons per hectare per year. That's a massive amount of soil coming from the fields and pastures each and every year. And this soil is filling the wetlands and the lake. By any measure, outside of a geological event at a landscape level, this is a lot of erosion. If 80% of the population lives in rural areas, where do the remaining 20% of the people live? That's a great question. What are the major cities in the Lake Victoria Basin? There are 3 large urban areas in each of the basin countries that lie along the lake. One of these cities is the city of Entebbe in Uganda. That is shown here. While there is a lot of sedimentation and pollution entering the lake from the farmed areas, the cities are also contributing to water quality problems. There is a lack of significant treatment of urban runoff, meaning that raw sewage frequently runs into the lake, carrying high levels of phosphorus and pathogens. There is also pollution from industrial sources, carrying more persistent sources of pollution that can pose serious long-term health challenges. While there are significant water quality problems within the Lake Victoria Basin, that is not the only threat to the region. There are also dams that influence the level of the lake. While these dams can create a backfill reservoir in the lake, they also provide hydroelectric power. This means that when there is a drought, there is an instantaneous conflict between maintaining lake water levels and providing electricity and preserving the outflow to the Nile River system. With the lake basin being so sensitive to rainfall, even small droughts can create substantial conflicts between users. To summarize, there are 4 primary stresses on the lake. There are stresses happening within the lake. There are stresses happening directly adjacent to the lake. There are stresses happening to the upland regions around the lake. And there are stresses that are occurring outside the lake basin, but which are influencing the basin or being carried into the basin by winds. Being the second largest freshwater lake in the world, the scale of the problems are massive. However, lying in the middle of Africa means that the availability for locally generated funds is limited. The region does not have a history of producing wealth on the scale required to address many of these problems. In addition, while these are important environmental problems, there are also significant socioeconomic problems within the region that will take precedence over solving water quality and quantity issues within the basin. While the problems are large, an additional confounding factor is that the basin is spread over 5 countries. However, in a forward-looking move to create a structure in which basin-wide problems can be addressed, the 5 countries came together to form the Lake Victoria Basin Commission. The Lake Victoria Basin Commission, or LVBC, has a vision of having a prosperous population living in a healthy and sustainably managed environment, providing equitable opportunities and benefits. While the challenges are great, the LVBC and those who they represent can surely achieve this long-term vision to move the lake back into a condition that benefits everyone living within the larger basin. There are several exciting projects and programs being implemented by the Commission. As the basin spreads across many countries, information sharing and coordination are going to be critical to any meaningful success. The Integrated Water Resource Management Program is one effort through which the countries come to share information and identify high-priority investment activities. These actions are targeted to improving water quality within the lake, particularly through the reduction of effluent from urban areas. As with many of the world's lakes, Lake Victoria is facing challenges related to climate change. However, the financial resources to adopt mitigation activities is a lot for any one community or one nation to acquire. The Basin Commission is working to build governing and institutional capacity at varying scales. This capacity building will empower local and regional entities to optimize their resources to face the coming challenges. In addition, there is a major effort at sharing information on what is working and what strategies can be scaled or adapted to the different regions in the basin. Finally, these efforts are leading to the strengthening of communities so they can be resilient to the changes brought about by a warming climate. With the recognition of the need for a stable and economically viable agricultural industry, there are substantial efforts underway to help farmers upgrade their practices to ones that are well adapted to the climate and soil within the basin. In addition to farming practices, there is also an effort underway to ensure that farming remains economically viable for those living throughout the basin. With so many people living in rural areas, ensuring that farming is done in a way that limits the damage to the lake will be vital for ensuring the improvements to the lake while keeping the land viable and productive for those living in rural areas. While the region is not independently wealthy and lacks significant resources with which to solve the major challenges contributing to the degradation of the lake, there are people and groups and nations that have recognized the global importance of Lake Victoria. These groups have helped through providing funding and technical expertise to document, plan for, and implement solutions to bring the lake back to an improved condition. The people of the planet are stepping up to help out in the restoration of this globally important resource. Lake Victoria, being the second largest freshwater lake in the world, is a critical global feature. Being the largest freshwater lake in Africa makes it a vital continental resource. With its connection to the Nile River and its corresponding importance to the development of Western culture, Lake Victoria is truly one of the world's Great Lakes. There are a lot of challenges facing the lake, but the regional and global response is an indicator that people really care about this body of water. I would expect to see this lake see significant improvements through the hard work and dedication of the local communities, supported by a global network of care and concern.